These models, they don't come detailed enough. They're either cheap or detailed. You can't have both of them at the same time. Hey guys, welcome to another video of Life with Juan. It's me, Juan, and we're gonna be talking about something different. See, we've talked about the blood before, and now we're gonna be talking about something that's as far away from the blood as possible thanks to our blood-brain barrier. Yes, today we're talking about the brain. Now, in elementary, you were probably taught about the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. But I bet they never taught you about this little bugger that lies deep in your diencephalon. Yeah, that's right. Today, we'll be talking about the miniature, magnificent, multifunctional thalamus. So what's the thalamus? It's one of a pair of egg-shaped clusters sitting in your diencephalon.
I love eggs.
This is the part of your brain that's smack dab in the middle of the lobes of your cerebrum. Each thalamus relays information pertaining to memory, motor, and sensory function. And the thalami are like command centers that allow this special coordination. In a sense, your thalami are like some sort of brain within your brain, some sort of brainception. So these are located in your diencephalon, dangling over your third ventricle via the interthalamic adhesion. The sides of the thalamus are touching your internal capsule, separated from the basal globus pallidus and the putamen. The dorsal parts form the lower part of each lateral ventricle, and the ventral parts are continuous with the brain's reticular formation. I know these are some big words, but stay tuned and I eventually will be discussing each of these in future videos. So each thalamus is divided into three main segments: the medial-dorsal, the anterior, and the lateral, by the internal medullary lamina. In addition to this, the thalamus also has the geniculate bodies, namely the lateral and the medial geniculus. There's also a reticular area, separated from the main body of the thalamus by the external medullary lamina. The thalamus is intimately connected with the rest of the brain by means of thalamic peduncles, of which there are four. The anterior peduncle passes anteriorly, going past the anterior internal capsule to reach the prefrontal cortex and the cingulate gyrus. Above, the superior peduncle passes the posterior internal capsule to reach the sensory and premotor motor cortices. At the back, the posterior peduncle connects to the occipital lobe and the posterior parieto-temporal lobes. Finally, the inferior peduncle reaches the anterior temporal and orbital cortices. These connections play a huge role in the thalamus's function to coordinate the different functions of the brain at large. Now that we've spoken of the thalamus's general structure, let's talk each individual nucleus located inside the thalamus. You can kind of tell the function of each nucleus based on the afferents feeding into it, as well as the nucleus's own efferents. Let's start with the anterior nucleus. It sits right at the cockpit of our thalamic ship. In this stylized thalamus, which I drew all by myself, by the way, I've colored it cyan. The anterior thalamic nucleus receives afferents from the mammillary bodies via the mammaliothalamic tract. These are a big part of the brain's limbic system, as well as the hippocampus. This is important for the processing of episodic memory, and as such, the anterior nucleus has an efferent that is the cingulate gyrus. I'm going to symbolize this nucleus with a tiny floppy disk, the nostalgia of which would remind any 90s kid of the good old days, like myself. You see, episodic memories is one's memory of things that happened, like circumstances, and mind you, everything surrounding the person during those circumstances. So, there's one other nucleus that's involved with processing memory, but we'll get to that a bit later. Next, we have the ventral anterior nucleus. This is located slightly behind the anterior nucleus. I've colored it red, and it receives afferents from the globus pallidus of the basal ganglia, passing through the ansa lenticularis and the lenticular fasciculus. The ventral anterior nucleus then projects to the premotor cortex, which is located in the frontal lobe. If you remember basic neuroscience, you'll recall that the globus pallidus is the essential player of the nigrostriatal system, which is where, through the flow of dopamine, there is inhibition and disinhibition of the subthalamic nucleus and subsequently the globus pallidus, which then coordinates of the actions of the premotor cortex. I'm going to stamp this nucleus with a little cogwheel emoji to symbolize precise, coordinated pyramidal movements. Next up, the ventrolateral nucleus, which is colored yellow and divided into the anterior and posterior portions. The anterior portion receives afferents from the globus pallidus and projects to the supplementary motor cortex. The posterior part receives afferents from the cerebellum, particularly the contralateral dentate nucleus of the cerebellum. This then projects to the primary motor cortex, which controls the functions of our skeletal muscle. The ventrolateral nucleus then functions to conduct the synergistic actions of our muscles in performing precise, coordinated muscle movements. I'm going to symbolize this nucleus with a dancer because of the precise, sophisticated movements it performs. Behind the ventrolateral nucleus are the ventral posterior nuclei, namely the lateral and the medial. These are organized so as to receive somatosensory afferents, which can sense things like position, touch, and pain from the head, trunk, and limbs, and send these to the primary somatosensory cortex. The medial nucleus receives afferents from the head and the face, while the lateral nucleus receives afferents from the trunk and the limbs. Just think, lateral from limbs. That's a pretty straightforward mnemonic. Anyway, I'll symbolize these two nuclei with the hand and the face. Now, you might remember from earlier the geniculate bodies, which are responsible for receiving visual and auditory inputs from the eyes and the ears. And like the ventral posterior nuclei, we have the lateral and the medial geniculate bodies. The lateral geniculate receives inputs from the optic tract via the superior colliculus and sends these to the primary visual cortex in the brain's occipital lobe. Likewise, the medial geniculate gets afferents from the auditory pathway via the inferior colliculus and redirects the signals to the primary auditory complex of the temporal lobe. A simple mnemonic for this is lateral looks while medial makes music. For this, I'll use an eye and an ear to symbolize the geniculates. Whew! That was a mouthful. Let's take a step back for a minute, process what we just went through. All those nuclei were focused on specific neurologic functions, namely in memory, motor, and sensation, and as such, all these are called the specific nuclei. But in addition to these functions, the thalamus also has a role in associating and correlating information too. And in charge of these functions, we have the association nuclei. Let's start with the dorsolateral nucleus. Here it's colored orange. Remember the anterior nucleus earlier? The dorsolateral nucleus also has a role in the formation of memory. Like the anterior nucleus, this receives input from the hippocampus and sends information to the cingulate gyrus. But this also reciprocates with the cingulate gyrus, strengthening and fortifying how these memories are stored. Since this nucleus is involved with the long-term potentiation of memory, let's symbolize this with a CD-ROM, which stores read-only data. Now, at first, I colored the dorsal posterior nucleus orange differently from the pulvinar nucleus, which was brown, but then I realized these two had a similar function. Both of these receive afferents from the primary visual cortex, the primary auditory cortex, and the superior colliculus. These will then send efferents to the visual association cortex, also in the brain's occipital lobe, as well as the parietal cortex. These all work together to help your mind understand and localize everything that you can sense going on in the world around you, like a compass, which I'll use to symbolize this area. The last of the association nuclei is the dorsal medial nucleus, which here I have colored a royal blue. The dorsal medial nucleus receives input from the olfactory tubercle, which is located in the uncus of the parahippocampal gyrus, as well as the limbic system. It then reciprocates with the prefrontal cortex, regulating mood, higher function, and judgment. Since it regulates judgment, I'll use a balance scale to symbolize this region, and this is a good visual association too, since this is the nucleus closest to the interthalamic adhesion, the fulcrum of the thalami, if you will. That's it for the association nuclei. Now we just have two more nuclei of the thalamus to discuss. The nonspecific nuclei have broad general function and essentially just associates everything with anything. The first of these is the interthalamic nuclei. These are located in the internal medullary lamina, which have been stylized here with a plum purple color. These are physically continuous with the reticular formation from where they receive their afferents. These also receive afferents from the basal ganglia and the limbic system. These then project to the entire cerebral cortex and the corpus striatum. These essentially comprise a huge role in regulating the thalamo-cortical pathway. I'll use a spider web to represent this. Finally, we have the reticular nuclei, colored dark blue, separated from the main body of the thalamus by the external medullary lamina, colored flesh. This receives afferents from the cerebral cortex, as well as the thalamus itself, with which it reciprocates. This processes all other thalamocortical projections in the thalamus, providing collateral branches projecting to the cortex. These nuclei consist largely of GABAergic neurons, which are inhibitory in nature. These function to modulate and control the rate of discharge of the thalamic projections to the cortex. This may also function to disinhibit neurons from other thalamic pathways by inhibiting its own neurons, thereby enhancing and focusing the activity of the said pathways. I'll use a video game controller for this nucleus, as this essentially coordinates the activities of the whole thalamus. It's like the thalamus of the thalamus. Thalamusception! And that, guys, ends our discussion on the thalamus. For this video, I referred to Clinical Neuroanatomy and Neuroscience by Fitzgerald, as well as Basic Clinical Neuroscience by Young. And that, guys, ends our discussion on the thalamus. This particular video is dedicated to the future doctors of the Philippines, especially my seniors from the ASMPH class of 2019 who will be taking their boards soon. I actually started this series partially with the intent to help them in studying for the board exams, but medical internship got a lot of my time, so I wasn't able to maintain this as regularly as I would have wanted. I want to say Godspeed to you all, and I hope you'll do your best in our upcoming board exams. Fight! You are the light. It's an inside thing. Do us proud. I'm rooting for you. Anyway, please like, Comment down below if you have any thoughts, questions, or suggestions, and click subscribe as well as hit the bell icon to stay tuned for future videos. As always, this is Juan, and remember, live life to the fullest because you only have one life to live.
Word of the day.
Thalamus.
Na 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 na.
T-H-A-L-A-M-N-U-S, thalamus. While the lateral nucleus receives afferents from the trunk and the limbs. Oh, I got a message. Wait. Oh my gosh. Too many sounds. I have to stop these sounds before I continue the video. Ah, sounds. Be quiet, sounds. 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 Okay. There we go. Okay.